For 7 years, no woman had gotten close to Vincent Marchetti. Not close enough to touch him. Not close enough to say his first name out loud and get away with it. At 37, he ran the freight terminals along Chelsea and Everett, the working waterfront north of Boston, the way other men run a business. Quietly, completely, and without ever asking twice. He lived alone in an armored estate out in Weston. 16 rooms, not one photograph on any wall, and there was a single rule every person who worked in that house learned on their first day. Nobody touches Mr. Marchetti. Not a handshake. Not a hand on the sleeve. In 7 years, nobody had. Then came that late night. Vincent came up the stairs past 2 in the morning. Shirtless. His shirt was ruined, and he'd left it somewhere on the floor below, the gun still heavy in his right hand. He pushed open the door to his own bedroom, and he stopped. There was someone in his bed. A woman. Still in her gray maid's uniform, her shoes still on her feet, sound asleep on top of his sheets like she'd earned the right to be there. She didn't hear the door. She didn't move. Any other man in his position would have had her dragged out into the snow before she ever opened her eyes, and every man who worked for him would have called that mercy. Vincent didn't move. He stood there in the dark with a loaded gun in his hand, and he couldn't have told you why. What he did next, nobody in that house, least of all him, would ever be able to explain. If you love a story about two broken people finding their way to each other, do me a favor and hit that like button, share it with someone who could use it tonight, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let's go back to where it all began, to that Tuesday in January, and to the woman who had no idea whose life she was about to walk into. 3 days before that Tuesday, Charlotte Bishop stood behind her sister's wheelchair in the day room at Mercy Grace and pulled a wide-toothed comb through Julia's hair, one slow stroke at a time, starting at the ends the way she always did so it wouldn't hurt. Julia's hair had gotten long. Nobody there had time for it, and Charlotte hadn't been able to bring herself to cut it. So twice a week, she came in on her lunch hour and worked out the tangles with her fingers first, then the comb, then a little detangler she bought at the dollar store, because the good kind ran $7 a bottle, and this one ran $2. Julia sat with her hands open in her lap, palms up, the way they always fell now. Her eyes were open too. They were the same gray-green they'd always been, and they moved when something moved, but they didn't move to Charlotte's face, and hadn't since August. So Charlotte talked. She'd learned to talk into that silence without waiting for anything to come back. She told Julia that the man at the laundromat had finally fixed the machine that ate quarters. She told her that somebody had planted daffodil bulbs in the strip of dirt outside her building, and that come spring, they'd probably come up crooked, because whoever did it planted them upside down. She told her the Camry hadn't started that morning, which was true, and that she'd gotten it going on the second try, which wasn't. She'd gotten it going on the 5th, sitting there in the lot with her forehead on the steering wheel, telling herself she'd deal with it Saturday. Everything got dealt with Saturday. Saturday was where Charlotte kept the things she couldn't afford to look at yet. She parted Julia's hair and started braiding it, and while her hands worked, she felt for the shape of the day ahead. The shift at the diner off Dorchester Avenue until 3, an hour to change, then the office cleaning job downtown until 11 at night. 2 jobs, $26 in her checking account, and a Ziploc bag in her glove compartment, with $14 in quarters and dimes that she'd been telling herself was for laundry, and knew perfectly well was for gas. She was 27 years old. She hadn't bought anything for herself since Christmas, and the thing she'd bought at Christmas was a pair of work shoes. Miss Bishop. Charlotte turned with the braid still in her hand. It was the woman from billing, the one with the lanyard and the tired kindness, holding a folder against her chest, the way people hold folders when they don't want you to see the front of them. "Do you have a minute?" She didn't. She had 11, and then she'd be late. "Sure," Charlotte said. They stepped into the hallway. The woman opened the folder and turned it around, and Charlotte made herself look at it, because looking away had never once made a number smaller. "The insurer came back on the intensive program," the woman said. "They're calling it not medically necessary. I want to be honest with you. That's what they call almost everything at this stage." Charlotte nodded. She'd learned the vocabulary the way you learn a language you never wanted to speak. Not medically necessary meant they'd decided her sister was as good as she was going to get. "We filed the appeal Monday," the woman went on. "It's pending, but the program's already been running on the provisional authorization, and that runs out at the end of the month. If the appeal doesn't come back in your favor, and I'd rather you hear this from me than from a letter, the balance transfers to you." Charlotte's mouth was dry. How much? The woman turned the page. 85,000. It was a number so far outside anything Charlotte had ever held that it didn't even land as fear. It landed as noise, a sound with no shape to it. She kept her face still. She'd gotten good at that. And if I can't, then she doesn't stay in the program. She'd be transferred to a state facility. There's one in Fall River with an opening. The woman's voice went careful. They'll keep her safe. They'll keep her clean. But there's no therapy staff. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you she'd keep making progress. Because she wouldn't. She's making progress, Charlotte said. The therapist said last week she tracked a sound. She turned her head. I know. She turned her head. I know she did, honey. Charlotte looked at the floor for a second, then straightened up. End of the month. End of the month. Okay, Charlotte said. And she meant it the way people mean okay, when there's no other word that fits. And then she went back into the day room and finished the braid. Her hands were steady. She tied it off with an elastic from her wrist and came around to the front of the chair and crouched down so she was level with her sister's face, close enough to smell the drugstore detangler, and she waited there the way she waited every single visit, giving it every chance. Julia looked at the window. Charlotte put her hand over both of Julia's open palms and held them a moment. I'll be back Thursday, she said. Don't let them cut your hair. Out in the parking lot, the Camry didn't start on the first try, or the second. On the fourth it caught, and she sat there with the engine shaking under the hood and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding all week, and there was no version of it that got her anywhere near $85,000 by the end of the month. That night she called the staffing agency and told them she'd take anything. Anything at all, she said, and she'd work whatever hours they had. The next afternoon, 2 days before that Tuesday, 3 cars came up the drive in Weston and Declan Sheridan got out of the middle one. He was 55 and he'd been coming to houses like this his whole life, and he came in the way. Older men come in when they want you to remember they were doing this before you were born. Slow, hands loose, taking his time with the walk. Salvatore Gallo met him in the front hall. Salvatore was 52, and he had a way of standing slightly to the left and half a step behind that made him look like furniture until you needed him. Declan, he said, he's in the back. How's his mood? He's got a mood? Salvatore said, and Sheridan laughed, and that was the last easy thing that happened for the next 20 minutes. Vincent didn't get up when they came in. He was standing at the far end of the room, with his back to the window and his hands in his pockets, and he stayed exactly where he was while Sheridan sat, and while Sheridan's niece sat, and while Salvatore closed the door. The niece was 29, Fiona. She kept her chin level and her hands in her lap, and she'd clearly been told what this was before she got in the car. Vincent, Sheridan said, I appreciate you making time. You've got 15 minutes. Then I won't spend them on the weather. Sheridan leaned forward. The terminals north of the river ought to be run by one house. You know it. I know it. Everybody who moves anything through Chelsea knows it. We've been circling each other for 4 years and paying twice for the same protection. That ends the day our families stop being 2 families. And how do they stop being 2 families? The old way. Sheridan gestured, small and easy, toward the young woman beside him. Fiona, my brother's girl. Smart, discreet. She grew up in this. She knows what she'd be walking into. And she's not squeamish about it. You put a ring on her hand and there isn't a crew from Everett to South Boston that would move against either of us. Vincent looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at a shipping manifest, and Fiona held it, which took something, and then he looked back at her uncle. No, Vincent. You came out here to sell me a wife, Vincent said. You'd have done better bringing me $4.2 million. The room got very quiet. Sheridan's face didn't change, but something behind it did. That again. That still. 3 loads, Sheridan said. 3 loads went missing off a dock I don't control, and you've decided they're mine because it's convenient. They cleared through your people, your paper, your seals, your names on the gate log. Vincent took one hand out of his pocket and set it flat on the back of a chair, and he still didn't sit. I'm not calling you a thief, Declan. I'm telling you the number's yours until somebody hands me a better name. 4.2, by the end of the month. The end of the month. Yes. And if it isn't there, then I stop coming to the table, Vincent said. And after that it won't matter what we talk about. Sheridan sat with that a moment. He was old enough to have heard men say things like that when they didn't mean them, and old enough to know the difference. He stood up. "You're your father's son," he said, and it wasn't a compliment. "My father sat at this table for 30 years, Vincent said. "Look how that went." Fiona rose with her uncle. She'd said nothing the entire time, and now she stepped forward and put out her hand, because that's what you do. Because she'd been raised right. Because her uncle had probably told her in the car to be gracious no matter which way it went. Her hand hung there in the air between them. Vincent didn't move. He looked at her hand, and he didn't take it, and he didn't explain, and the silence went on one beat too long and then two, and Fiona's face began to change. Salvatore stepped in smoothly, the way a man steps in front of a draft. "Miss Sheridan," he said, taking her hand in both of his and giving it a warm and slightly overlong shake. "You'll forgive him. He's had a week. Let me walk you both out. Declan, you still got that place on the water down in Hull?" And he talked all the way to the front door, easy and full of nothing, and by the time the cars pulled away, he'd almost made it look like an ordinary afternoon. When he came back, Vincent was gone from the room. Salvatore found him in the small bathroom off the hallway with the water running. He stood in the doorway and watched for a second, then two, then a while longer. Vincent had his sleeves pushed up, and he was working the soap over his hands the way surgeons do it, between the fingers, up over the wrists, and he'd already done it once, because the bar was wet through and the mirror was fogged. He didn't look up. "You're going to take the skin off," Salvatore said. Vincent kept washing. The girl was insulted. "She'll live. Declan won't forget it." "Good," Vincent said. "Then he'll remember the number." He shut the water off and stood there a moment with his hands dripping, and he didn't reach for the towel right away, and Salvatore watched him not reach for it. "End of the month," Salvatore said quietly. "I'll put the word out on the gate logs. Somebody signed those loads through. I'll find him." "Do that." Salvatore nodded and left, and Vincent turned the water back on. The agency called Charlotte back on Monday morning, and the woman on the phone read the terms off a screen without any particular interest in them. Private residence, Weston, domestic staff, $28 an hour to start, cash by check every Friday, no overtime cap. Charlotte asked her to say the number again. She was standing in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and a mug of instant coffee going cold on the counter. And she did the math right there while the woman waited, and it came out to roughly 3 times what the diner and the office job paid her together for the same hours. "There's a background check," the woman said. "Everybody gets one. It'll come back with something. Everybody's comes back with something. That's not my department." A pause. "They're not looking for a clean sheet. They're looking for somebody who doesn't talk." "I don't talk." "Then you'll do fine. Be there at 7 tomorrow." So on Tuesday morning, Charlotte drove west with a gas gauge that had been sitting under a quarter tank for 2 days, and the Camry got her all the way there, which she took as more of a sign than it was. There was a gate, then a driveway that went on long enough that she wondered whether she'd turned into the wrong place, and then a house at the end of it that didn't look like a house so much as a decision somebody had made about the world. She parked where a man in a dark coat pointed her to park. He didn't say good morning. He looked at her identification, wrote something down, and waved her toward a side entrance, and that was the whole of it. Inside, 5 new hires stood in a row on a stone floor, while a woman walked the length of them with a clipboard held against her hip. Margaret Hale was 61, gray at the temples, and she had the particular flat voice of someone who'd given this exact talk many times and had stopped hoping any of it would be interesting. "You'll be paid on Fridays," she said. "You'll be paid well. You already know that, or you wouldn't be standing here at 7 in the morning in January." She turned and started back down the line. "So let's talk about what you're being paid for. You do not speak unless you're spoken to. You do not make eye contact with Mr. Marchetti, and you do not make eye contact with anyone who comes through that front door as his guest. If you see something, you didn't. If you hear something, you didn't. You don't ask each other about it either, because there's no such thing as a private conversation in this house, and the sooner you accept that, the longer you'll last." She stopped walking. Last one. Something in the room changed. Charlotte felt it before she understood it. The way you feel a floor go soft under you. Margaret Hale let the pause go long. "Nobody," she said, "touches Mr. Marchetti." She said it slowly, one word set down after another, the way you'd give directions to somebody driving in a storm. Not a handshake, not brushing past him in a corridor. If you're carrying something and he's coming the other way, you stop and you put your back to the wall and you wait. If he drops something, you don't pick it up and hand it to him. You set it on the nearest surface and you step back. I'm not going to explain it, and you're not going to ask. Break the other rules and you'll be let go. Break that one and I can't help you. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Margaret consulted the clipboard. Bishop. Yes, ma'am. East wing. Second floor. Dust. Vacuum. Linens. Bath. You'll find the cart at the top of the service stairs. And Charlotte, who had spent the last hour trying to be a person nobody would remember, felt the 4 women beside her turn and look at her all at once. It was quick. It was gone as fast as it came, but she'd been in enough rooms to know what she'd just seen on their faces, and what she'd seen was pity, mixed with something a good deal more relieved. Nobody said anything. Margaret said, "Move," and they moved. The east wing was quiet in a way the rest of the house wasn't. Charlotte pushed the cart down a corridor with a runner so thick the wheels made no sound at all, and let herself into the room at the end, and stood there for a second longer than she should have. It was a large room. It was an expensive room, and there wasn't a single photograph in it. Not on the dresser, not on the desk, not on the wall going up toward the ceiling. Not one. And she noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth, because in every house she'd ever cleaned, there'd been somebody's grandchild in a frame. She worked. She stripped the bed and remade it. She wiped down surfaces that were already clean. She ran the vacuum in slow, overlapping lines, the way she'd been taught 15 years ago by a woman at a motel off Route 9. It took her most of 2 hours. And when she came around the far side of the room to dust the front of a locked glass cabinet, she stopped. Behind the glass, on a shelf with a watch and a heavy fountain pen and things she didn't have names for, sitting all by itself, there was a teacup, white porcelain, the cheap kind. The glaze was crazed all over with fine brown lines, and there was a chip out of the rim, a real chip, the size of a fingernail. It had been set at the very front of the shelf, closer to the glass than anything else. Charlotte looked at it for a moment. Then she dusted the frame of the cabinet, and she didn't touch it. And she moved on. By 7 that evening, Salvatore had a name off the gate logs, and by 9 Vincent was standing in a cold back office off the freight yard with his coat still on, listening to a warehouse manager explain himself. The man had been signing loads through for 11 months. He'd been paid in cash by people he'd never met, and he'd told himself, the way men do, that he was only moving paper. He talked for a long time. Vincent let him. He'd expected to feel something, and he found that he didn't, and that was the part that wore on him, standing there with his hands in his pockets while a grown man cried about his mortgage. There'd been a version of Vincent, years back, that would have felt the anger arrive like weather. Now there was just the tiredness, sitting low behind his eyes, the same tiredness that had been there Monday and the week before Monday. $4.2 million, Vincent said, when the man finally ran out of words. Not through me. I swear on my mother, not through me. I signed. That's all I did. I signed. I believe you. The man started crying harder, out of relief, which was a mistake. Who paid you? I don't know their names. Then that's what you've got to work with, Vincent said, because that's what you're going to spend the rest of the week finding out. Salvatore was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded. He'd been quiet the whole time, which was his way, and when he spoke, he kept his voice low and reasonable, the voice of a man offering to carry something heavy for you. Vincent, he's talked to people. He'll talk to more. He'll talk to me. That's not what I'm saying. I know what you're saying. Vincent turned around. The answer's no. 4.2 million. I don't kill people over money, Vincent said. Not ever. Not once. My father did, and it cost him everything he built, and it cost me a good deal more than that. He looked at the man on the floor. Get him out of here. Take his keys. Take his badge. Take the truck. He's got until Friday to give me a name, and then he's got until Saturday to be out of Suffolk County. Salvatore held his eyes a moment longer than he needed to, then nodded, easy again. You're the boss. Yes. Always have been. And then it happened the way it always happened, which is to say without warning and over nothing at all. One of the men by the door, young, trying to be useful, reached out to steady Vincent as he came through the narrow gap between the desk and the wall, and got a hand on his forearm, high up, gripping the sleeve. Vincent tore his arm back so fast that the kid stumbled. It wasn't a decision. It was the way you come off a hot pan, the whole body doing it before the mind is consulted. And for a second Vincent stood there in a small, crowded office, breathing through his nose, while every man in the room found something else to look at. Don't, Vincent said. Boss, I'm sorry. I didn't. I know. He walked out into the yard. His shirt had gone through at the sleeve somewhere in the last hour, torn along the seam and marked besides, and he could feel it against his skin the whole ride back, the wet cold of it. And by the time the car came up, the drive in Weston, it was well past 1 in the morning, and the only thing in the world he wanted was to be alone. He went in through the back. He stopped in the washroom on the ground floor and stood at the sink and worked the buttons open one at a time, and then he pulled the shirt off and dropped it in the basket by the door and didn't look at it again. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, Charlotte was still working. One of the day women had walked off at noon without giving notice, and Margaret Hale had come up the service stairs at 4 in the afternoon and told Charlotte she'd be covering the west corridor and the 2 guest baths on top of her own wing, and hadn't phrased it as a question. Charlotte had said yes, ma'am. She'd been saying yes, ma'am, since she was 19. By 6, her throat had started to feel wrong, that thin, scraped feeling, and by 9 she'd stopped being able to tell whether the house was too warm or she was, and by 11 she'd worked out that she had a fever, and had decided, in the way she decided most things, that it could wait until Saturday. She finished the west corridor at 12:20, then she went back to the east wing, because the linens hadn't been changed, and Margaret Hale checked the linens. Her arms didn't want to lift. She got the fitted sheet on by walking the corners one at a time, resting between each, and she got the flat sheet over it and squared, and she pulled the heavy coverlet up and smoothed it flat with both palms, twice, slowly, because her vision kept going soft at the edges and smoothing it was easier than standing still. Then she straightened up and the room tipped, and she put her hand out and found the edge of the mattress, and she sat down on it. Just for a minute. That was the whole thought, and it was a reasonable one. A minute to let her heart settle, and then she'd finish the bath and take the cart down and drive home and sleep in her own bed. The room was very quiet. The mattress under her was the softest thing she'd touched in 3 years. She'd been on her feet for 18 hours, and she had $85,000 due at the end of the month, and she was 27 years old, and so tired that the tiredness had stopped feeling like a thing that happened to her and started feeling like the shape of her life. She put one hand down on the coverlet. She meant to stand up. She closed her eyes. The anger came up through him fast and clean, the first thing he'd felt all day that had any heat in it. Somebody had been in this room. Somebody had been in this room and had gotten all the way onto the bed and had gone to sleep there. And the part of him that ran the terminals and settled arguments and made men afraid of quiet rooms was already moving. He crossed the floor. He set the gun down on the low table by the wall because he'd need the hand, and he reached out to take a fistful of the back of that uniform and put her on the floor and be done with it. And his arm came forward, and then it stopped. There was a tear on her face. It had come out from under her closed eye and gone down along the bridge of her nose, and it was still moving, catching the small light from the hall, running slow into her hair. She was asleep. She was deeply asleep, breathing through her mouth, and her forehead was tight and her jaw was working slightly. And while he stood there with his hand in the air, she said something. It wasn't clear. It came out thick and slurred and mostly air, and he had to hold still to get it. A name. She said it once, then again, half of it the second time. Julia. Then her breath caught and evened out, and she went quiet again. Vincent stood in the dark, with his hand a foot from her shoulder. He didn't lower it right away. He couldn't have said what he was waiting for. Some part of him kept expecting the anger to come back and finish what it had started, and it didn't come back. What came instead was the tiredness, all of it at once, the full weight of it dropping onto him the way a wave drops on a man who's been standing too long in the surf. He'd been awake for 40 hours. He'd been awake through Monday, and through Sheridan, and through the yard and the office, and the crying man on the floor, and he had $4.2 million missing, and a name he still didn't have, and he was standing in his own bedroom at 2 in the morning trying to decide what to do about a sleeping woman. He looked at the chair by the window. He looked at the door. He thought about the hallway and about Margaret Hale's rooms downstairs and about the phone in his pocket, and every one of those things required him to speak to somebody, and he found he'd reached the end of what he could do that night. He lowered his hand. He picked the gun up off the table and set it on the nightstand within reach, the way he'd set it down every night for 7 years. And then he walked around to the far side of the bed. He sat on the edge and took his shoes off, one and then the other, and lined them up against the frame. Then he lay down on top of the blanket, on his back, on his own side, with a good 3 feet of empty bed between them. He didn't pull anything over himself. He looked at the ceiling. He listened to her breathe. It was uneven and a little rough, the sound of somebody with a fever, and he counted it without meaning to, the way you count the ticking of a clock in a strange room. He waited to feel the wrongness of another person being there. It didn't come. He waited a while for it. Then he stopped waiting and his eyes closed, and the last thing he was aware of was the small, ordinary sound of her breathing, and after that there was nothing at all. No floor of the mind he usually walked all night. No gray hours, nothing. Sometime before dawn he came partway up out of it. He didn't know why at first. Then he did. She'd turned in her sleep, and her arm had come across the space between them, and her hand had landed on his forearm, palm down, resting there with her fingers slack against his skin. He went completely still. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew it the way you know the shape of a stair in the dark, because it had happened every single time for 7 years, since a Tuesday in a different January, and it always went the same way. The cold up the back of the neck first, then the crawl across the shoulders, then the stomach turning over, the sweat, the animal need to get the skin away from the skin, and it didn't matter who it was, or how gentle or how meant. His body had made its ruling a long time ago, and had never once been argued out of it, so he lay there in the dark and waited for it. He waited. Her hand was warm. It was heavier than he'd have guessed, and slightly rough across the palm, and she didn't stir, and the pulse in her wrist was going quick from the fever, and he could feel it against his forearm, steady, small, insistent. He waited. It didn't come. The cold didn't come, and the crawl didn't come, and his stomach stayed exactly where it was. Nothing happened at all, except that a woman he'd never spoken to was touching his arm, and he was lying there letting her, and that was worse. That was very much worse, and it went through him with more force than any of the rest of it, because a man can live his whole life inside a rule and never once look at it, and the moment the rule breaks, he has to look. He didn't move her hand. He didn't move away from it. He lay there in the dark with his eyes open, and then, without deciding to, he was asleep again, and it was the first real sleep he'd had in 7 years. She surfaced slowly, the way you come up out of a fever, and for a few seconds, she didn't know anything, except that she was warm, and that she'd been warm for a long time. Then, the mattress registered. It was too firm and too wide, and it didn't sag in the middle the way hers did. And she opened her eyes onto a wall she'd dusted the day before. Charlotte came off that bed so fast, she took the coverlet halfway with her. Her legs went out from under her at the edge, and she caught herself on the nightstand, and shoved back up and turned. And Vincent Marchetti was standing across the room by the window with his back to it, already dressed, watching her. He'd been watching her for a while. She could tell by the stillness of him. "Oh God," she said. "Oh my God, I'm sorry. Mr. Marchetti, I am so sorry." He didn't answer. "I was sick. I had a fever. I still have it. I sat down for a minute. I was going to finish the bath and take the cart down. I sat down for 1 minute. That's the truth. I swear to you that's the truth." Her hands were shaking so hard she pressed them flat against her legs to make it stop, and it didn't stop. She was already backing toward the door. "You don't have to pay me this week. You don't have to pay me at all. I'll go right now. I'll get my things out of the locker downstairs, and I'll go and you'll never see me again. I never touched anything. I never opened anything. I only did the room. I only ever did the room." She was breathing too fast, and she knew she was, and she couldn't get underneath it. She'd spent 3 years learning exactly how quickly a life can be taken away from a person who has no way to argue, and she stood there in a rich man's bedroom in a wrinkled uniform, and understood that she was very likely not going to be allowed to leave this house. "Stop moving," he said. It wasn't loud. She stopped anyway, the way you stop when a hand comes down on a wheel. He came away from the window. He didn't come toward her. He went to a low cabinet in the corner and took out a glass, and poured water into it from a pitcher, and then he crossed the room and held it out at arm's length. Charlotte looked at it. She didn't move. "Take the water," he said. She reached out and took it. Her fingers didn't touch his. He let go the instant the glass was in her hand and stepped back, and she stood there holding it. And then she drank it. All of it. Because her throat felt like it had been scraped with a wire brush, and because there was nothing else in the world to do. "You have a fever," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine. You were talking in your sleep." She went cold. She had no idea what she might have said. She had no idea what a person says at 2 a.m. in the house of a man everybody downstairs was afraid of. "I'm sorry," she said. Why didn't you wake me? The question was out before she could stop it, and she heard how stupid it was the second it left her, and she stood there waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Vincent looked at her for a moment. I was tired, he said. It was a lie. There were 6 men in this house who'd have carried her out to the road inside a minute, and he'd have only had to lift the phone off the table to say so. But he said it flatly, the way he said everything, and then he turned and went to the door and opened it. Put your shoes on. Go down to the kitchen and tell Mrs. Hale to give you the day off. Paid. Charlotte crouched and got her shoes, still not fully believing any of it. Is she going to fire me? No, Vincent said, because you're going to tell her that from now on you're the only person who cleans this room. Nobody else comes in here. Not her, not the day staff, not anyone. Only you. Charlotte looked up at him. He was already looking out into the corridor. Yes, sir, she said. Downstairs the kitchen was full and busy, and she'd meant to walk through it fast with her head down, and she got 4 steps in before the whole room went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like somebody had lifted the needle off a record. A woman at the sink stopped rinsing. 2 of the day women at the long table stopped talking with their mouths half open. Margaret Hale turned around from the counter with a cup in her hand and looked at Charlotte's uniform. The same one from yesterday, slept in, and then at Charlotte's face, and her expression didn't change at all, which was somehow the worst part. He says I'm the only one who does the East Wing now, Charlotte said. Nobody else goes in. Nobody said anything. Somewhere a faucet was still running. Margaret set her cup down. Then you'd better not be sick long, she said. Upstairs, Vincent stood alone in the room. He'd already sent the car away and told them he wasn't going down to the terminals until noon. He came around the bed to the far side, and he stood there a moment, and then he put his hand flat on the mattress where she'd been lying. It was still warm. He left it there longer than he had any reason to. He wasn't thinking about why he'd slept, though he knew he'd slept, 7 straight hours of it, more than he'd managed in years. That wasn't the question. The question was smaller and much worse, and it sat in him like something swallowed wrong. Why hadn't it made his skin crawl? She took the day, because she'd have been a fool not to take a paid day, and she came back Thursday to find that the house had made up its mind about her. It happened without a word being said. The break room went quiet when she came in for her coffee, the same way the kitchen had, and then it started up again in a lower register that had nothing to do with her. At the long table, the day women left a seat empty on either side of her. Not pointedly, just naturally, the way water finds a way around a stone. In the corridors they stepped aside for her, which nobody had ever done before, and there was nothing kind in it. Once, coming down the service stairs, she heard 2 of them stop mid-sentence on the landing below, and then start talking about a car insurance bill with great enthusiasm, and she went down past them and said good morning, and they said good morning back, and looked at her collar and her wrists and her hands. She understood what they were looking for. She'd have looked too. And Margaret Hale, who'd stopped speaking to her except to give instructions, gave those instructions in a voice that had gone flat and careful. A woman handling something she'd been told not to drop, and hadn't been told why. So Charlotte kept her head down and pushed her cart up to the East Wing, and the East Wing became the whole of her working life, and she learned the man who lived in it the only way she was ever going to learn him, which was from what he left behind. He didn't leave much. Most mornings the room was nearly untouched, the bed barely disturbed, a book face down on the nightstand and moved to a different one by the next day. Some mornings the bed hadn't been slept in at all. Then, in the second week, the perfection started to come apart in small ways. On a Tuesday, there was a heavy glass on the nightstand, half full, and whatever was in it smelled like smoke and peat and had been sitting there long enough to go warm. She washed it and put it back in the cabinet. On the Thursday, there was a suit jacket thrown over the arm of the chair by the window, which he'd never done before, and when she picked it up to hang it, the left cuff caught the light, and she saw the mark on it. A dark rust, brown, gone stiff, worked deep into the weave along the edge of the cuff. Charlotte stood there holding the jacket for a while. Her heart went over slowly, one heavy beat, and then another. She didn't call Mrs. Hale. She didn't put it back and walk out. She carried it into the bathroom and took the hydrogen peroxide off her cart and got a clean white cloth, and she worked at that cuff for 20 minutes, cold water only, dabbing from the outside in the way she'd learned taking care of her sister, and she kept at it until the fabric came up clean and even, and there was nothing there at all. Then she pressed it dry and hung the jacket in the closet with the others, facing the same way. She didn't leave a note. She didn't mention it, and she never asked. He noticed. He noticed the cuff first, because he'd expected a conversation about it, and there wasn't one. Then he began to notice other things. The heavy curtains were always drawn to exactly the same point every evening, closed past the window frame by 4 or 5 inches on the east side, so that the morning sun couldn't come through the gap and land on the head of the bed. And he'd never told anyone that, and nobody had ever done it before. His books were never stacked, only moved to the table, the page kept, and there was no smell. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Every woman who'd ever been through these rooms had left something of herself in the air. Perfume on a pillowcase, a hand cream, some small flag planted in the territory. This one came and went, like weather, and the only trace of her was lemon and clean cotton, and the absence of anything wrong. It irritated him. It also wouldn't leave him alone. On the Monday of the 3rd week, Vincent went into his own room in the middle of the afternoon and set 2 things on the desk. The first was a leather ledger, and he opened it flat to a page in the middle. A page with routing numbers and account names written in his own hand, the kind of paper that had put men in federal prison for a decade, and that certain people in this city would have paid a great deal of money to photograph. The second was a loaded Glock, which he set down beside it, at an angle, casually, the way a man leaves something he's been carrying. Then he went out and closed the door and drove down to the terminals, and didn't come back until 2:30 in the morning. He let himself in and stood in the dark a moment. The room smelled faintly of lemon. He crossed to the desk and turned on the lamp. The ledger was exactly where he'd left it, closed now, squared to the edge of the desk, and the gun had been moved perhaps 6 inches, and set down on top of a gray microfiber cloth, folded twice into a neat rectangle, laid flat on the wood beneath it. Vincent stood looking at that folded cloth. Then a sound came out of him, short and rough, and it took him a moment to work out what it was, because it had been a very long time since he'd heard it in this room, and longer still since it had come from him. The Camry died for good on the Tuesday, in the lot behind her building, and after that Charlotte took the bus, which meant leaving an hour earlier and getting home an hour later, and standing at a shelter on Broadway in South Boston at 6:10 in the evening with her hands in her sleeves. That was where the woman found her. She came up on Charlotte's left and stood beside her at the shelter like anybody waiting. And then she said, "Charlotte Bishop," not as a question, and Charlotte turned. The woman was around 45, in a gray coat, no makeup. The sort of face that could have belonged to a school principal or a nurse manager. She held up a badge wallet, let Charlotte read it, and put it away. "Diane Keller. I'm with the Bureau. Organized Crime Unit out of the Boston field office. Can I have 10 minutes? My bus is in 6. Then I'll talk fast." She didn't move any closer, which Charlotte noticed. She took a folder out from under her arm and opened it to a photograph. "Do you know who this is?" It was Vincent, taken from a distance and slightly above, walking across a lot toward a car. Charlotte looked at it and said nothing. Keller turned to another one, 3 men on a sidewalk. "That's Salvatore Gallo. He's been with the family 30 years. Another, an older man Charlotte had never seen. That one's Declan Sheridan." She closed the folder. "The man whose sheets you change moves freight through Chelsea and Everett that nobody inspects. He collects from about 400 businesses in this city that would tell you, if you asked them in front of a camera, that they pay him gladly. He hasn't been arrested since he was 19 years old, not because he's careful, because everybody's afraid, and afraid holds up better than careful." Charlotte watched the traffic. "You've been in the house 19 days, Keller said. "And in the last week you've been made the only person permitted in his private rooms. That's not nothing. That's never happened before." "I clean," Charlotte said. "I know. That's all I do. I know that too." Keller shifted her weight. "Your sister's at Mercy Grace, the intensive program." Charlotte turned her head then, and she looked at Diane Keller properly for the first time. "There's a fund," Keller said. "It exists for people who help us, and it isn't small. And it moves faster than an insurance appeal does. I'm not going to insult you by pretending that isn't why I'm standing at this bus stop. You wouldn't have to do anything but keep your eyes open and tell me what's in the room. Names on paper. Who comes to the house. What's said." Charlotte let the silence sit a moment. Then she said, "I clean the room. I don't look, Miss Bishop." "I don't look," Charlotte said again. "And I don't listen. And I don't touch anything that isn't mine to touch. And that's not loyalty. Ma'am, that's just how I've stayed alive since I was 19 years old." The bus came up Broadway 3 blocks off, headlights swimming in the wet. Keller took out a card and held it out, and when Charlotte didn't take it, she reached over and tucked it into the outside pocket of Charlotte's bag. Keep it anyway. I don't want it. You'll want it, or you won't. It costs you nothing to have it. And then Keller said, in a tone that was slightly different from the one she'd been using, almost as though it had gotten away from her, we already have somebody inside that house. I'd just rather you weren't the one who dies for them. Charlotte was watching the bus. She heard it, and it went past her the way a great many things went past her that winter. And she got on and paid, and found a seat near the back, and by the time she thought about it again, it had gone soft at the edges, the way things do. She got home at 7:40. The apartment was cold, because she kept it at 58 to hold the bill down, and she'd just gotten her coat off when the phone rang and the screen said Mercy Grace, and she stood in the middle of the room and answered it. It was the woman from billing. She didn't waste time. The appeal came back this afternoon, she said. It was denied. I'm sorry, Charlotte. They upheld the original determination. Okay. The provisional authorization ends Friday. That's the end of the billing period. Charlotte closed her eyes. So Friday. Friday. If the balance isn't satisfied by close of business, the discharge order goes through over the weekend, and the transfer happens Monday morning. Fall River. I've already been asked to start the paperwork, and I've been holding it on my desk since 2 o'clock, and I can't hold it past Friday. They'll just move it around me. 85,000. 85,000. Charlotte sat down on the arm of the couch. She wasn't crying. She'd have said, if anybody had asked her, that she felt very little at all, which wasn't true but was close enough to work with. What she felt instead was her mind going quiet and cold and orderly, the way it went when there were no good options left, and it became a matter of pure arithmetic. She had $411. She had no car to sell. She had a credit score that had been ruined in a courtroom 3 years ago, and a name that came up wrong on every application. There was no bank in Massachusetts that would speak to her, and she'd already asked everybody she had left to ask, which was nobody. There was exactly one person in her life who could put $85,000 on a desk on a Wednesday and not notice it was gone. Thank you for calling me yourself, Charlotte said, and hung up, and sat there in her coat in a 58-degree room, thinking it through. She waited for him in his study, in the dark, in the chair by the door, and she'd been sitting there since 11. She hadn't turned on a lamp, because turning on a lamp would have meant one of the men outside seeing light under the door. And she hadn't gone up to his room because she had some idea, even then, that there were rooms in this house you could be found in, and rooms you couldn't. So she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart going, and she went over the words again, and at 1:10 she heard the car come up, the drive, and then the front door, and then nothing, for a long while, and then his step in the corridor. The door opened. She heard him reach for the light switch. Don't shoot. His hand stopped. He stood absolutely still in the doorway, and she couldn't see his face, only the shape of him against the hall, and she watched his other hand come partway across his body, and then stop as well. Then the light came on, hard and sudden, and she flinched. You're in my study, Vincent said. There was no surprise in it at all. That was the frightening part. I know. I'm sorry. She didn't get up. Her legs wouldn't have held her. He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself 2 fingers of something and didn't drink it, and he watched her the whole time in the dark of the window glass. She knew what she looked like. She'd looked at herself in the bus shelter and seen it. You've got 2 minutes, he said, turning around, to tell me why you're sitting in the dark in my house. Then I call downstairs. I need money. It came out of her flat and whole, all at once, like something dropped. Vincent said nothing. The silence went on long enough that she heard the clock in the corridor. You came into a locked room, he said finally, in this house, to ask me for a loan. Not a loan. Her chin came up a little, which cost her more than she'd have admitted. An advance. Or a trade. Whatever you want to call it. I need $85,000 by Friday. He set the glass down on the desk without drinking from it. What is it? Cards. No. Something in your arm. No. A man who owes the wrong people. My sister, Charlotte said. Her name's Julia. She's 30. Last summer, she was hurt and suffered a brain injury, and she's at Mercy Grace in the intensive program. And the insurance company decided last week that it isn't medically necessary for her to get any better. If I don't put $85,000 on that desk by Friday afternoon, they discharge her Monday to a state facility in Fall River, where they'll keep her clean and safe, and she'll never say another word for the rest of her life." Vincent studied her face. He'd spent 20 years reading men across tables. He knew every small thing a person does when the story is invented. The tell at the eye, the swallow, the hands going for a pocket, and he looked for all of it, and found none of it. There was only fear, straight through, with nothing else layered on it. He turned away toward the desk. "I'm not a bank. I know. I'm not a charity. And I'm not a man people come to for help. People who owe me money have very bad years." He said it to the wall. "So why would you come to me?" "Because you didn't wake me up," Charlotte said. He went still. "When I was sick," she said. "You could have had me dragged out. You could have fired me on the spot and no one in that kitchen would have thought twice about it. You didn't. You gave me a glass of water." She stopped, and then made herself finish it. "That's the only kind thing anybody has done for me in 3 years. There's nobody else left for me to ask." Vincent stood with his back to her for a moment longer. Then he came around and leaned against the front of the desk with his arms folded, and looked at this small, tired woman in a cheap coat sitting in his chair, and thought that the sensible thing, the thing he'd have done 6 months ago, was to write the check, dismiss her, and never see her again. $85,000 is a considerable debt, he said. "I know what it is. If I pay it, you don't work for Mrs. Hale anymore. You work for me, directly." Charlotte's breath caught somewhere high in her chest, and her mind went straight down into the dark, to every ugly arrangement she'd ever heard about, and her face must have shown it, because Vincent's mouth tightened. "I don't want your body," he said. "Look at me. I have no interest in buying a woman, and if that's what this were, I wouldn't need to buy it, which should tell you something about the world you've walked into. What I want is your time and your absolute loyalty." "Meaning what?" "Meaning you move into the staff wing permanently, this week. You don't leave the grounds without my permission. You're available whenever I need you, at whatever hour, and you don't discuss one word of what happens in this house with anyone outside it. Not a friend, not a landlord, not a stranger at a bus stop." He said it evenly. "You disappear from the outside world." She understood then what she was being handed. It was a cage. It happened to be the only warm thing anyone had offered her in years, and it was still a cage, and she could see the bars perfectly well. "For how long?" "Until it's paid down against your wages, less what it costs to keep you." He didn't hesitate. "Call it 5 years. 5 years." She thought about her sister's open hands in her lap. She thought about a state hospital in Fall River. "Do we have an agreement?" Vincent said. Charlotte stood up. Her legs held after all. "Write the check." He took the book out of the drawer and wrote it in hard, driving strokes, tore it free, and held it out. When her fingers closed on the paper, he didn't let go. He kept the tension on it and made her look at him. "One thing," he said quietly. "I'm not buying your body. I'm buying your time and your loyalty. So don't ever lie to me. Don't ever go behind me. I've had that done to me once already, and the man who did it isn't in a position to do it again." He let go of the check. Charlotte pressed it flat against her chest with both hands. "Friday," she said, "before close of business." And she walked out into the dark corridor without turning around. She moved in on the Sunday, and it took her one trip, 2 bags and a box, and a man carried the box up the service stairs for her, and set it down inside the door of a small room at the end of the staff wing, and didn't say anything about it. The room had a bed and a window and a radiator that worked, which meant that for the first winter in 3 years, Charlotte Bishop slept warm. She kept the box packed for a while. She wasn't superstitious about much, but she'd learned not to unpack until a thing had held for a month. Her work changed shape. She still did his rooms, because that was the arrangement and nobody else was permitted. But now there was more, and it came to her the way water finds a channel. She took over the household calendar. She told the chef what time he'd be eating and stopped him from cooking at 8 when Vincent wouldn't be back until 11. She kept his suits moving to the cleaner and back. She learned that if a man was waiting in the front hall at 4 in the afternoon, it was worth mentioning to him before he came in the door. And after the second time she did it, he said, "Keep doing that." And that was the whole conversation. She learned the rest by being in the room. She learned that he drank his coffee black, that he'd send back anything with sugar in it without comment, and simply not drink it. So she made it black, and he drank it. She learned that if she brought lilies into the house, he'd leave whatever room they were in inside of a minute, and after she noticed that she told the florist plainly that this house didn't take lilies, no explanation offered, and none asked for, and she learned that he read at 3 in the morning. She'd find the lamp still warm, and a book turned face down on the table. And it was always history, never anything else. The same 6 inches of shelf worked through and started again. Somewhere in the second week, she stopped moving them to the table and started leaving them exactly where he'd put them. Her sister started the program on the Monday after the check cleared. Charlotte was allowed 1 call a week, Sunday evenings, from the phone in the office off the kitchen, and the therapist got on the line the 3rd Sunday and said that Julia had followed a sound across the room twice in 1 session and had held a spoon for 11 seconds. Charlotte said thank you and hung up and stood there with her hand on the phone for a while, and then went back to work. She wrote the 11 seconds down on a piece of paper and put it in her pocket, and she carried it there until it went soft at the folds. It was around then that she came into his room one morning and found the glass cabinet unlocked. The door was open perhaps an inch, and on the shelf, the chipped white teacup had been moved. It was sitting slightly forward of where it always sat, and it had been washed, recently, because there was a faint ring of water on the shelf beneath it that hadn't dried, and the fine brown lines in the glaze looked darker for being clean. Charlotte stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the cabinet door until the catch took, and she did the room, and she didn't ask him about it, then or ever. What happened with the papers happened on a Thursday and lasted less than 2 seconds. He was at the desk and she came in with a folder from the front office, and she held it out, and he reached for it, and their fingers touched along the edge of the folder, hers underneath and his across the top, warm, unmistakable, the whole side of one hand against the whole side of another. Charlotte registered it and started to draw back the way she'd have drawn back from a hot pan, because she'd been told on her first morning what the one rule in this house was, and she'd watched Fiona Sheridan's hand hang in the air with nothing to hold it. But he didn't move. He took the folder and his hand stayed where it was for another half second, no longer, and then it was over and he was opening the file and reading. Charlotte went out. In the corridor she stopped and stood for a second with her hand curled shut, and then she went on down to the kitchen and got on with the afternoon, and neither of them mentioned it, that day or after. The house was quieter in those weeks than it had been. Vincent slept some nights and didn't others, but he slept. He came home earlier. Once he told her to take the Sunday call from his study instead of the office, because the office phone was on a line he didn't like, and she'd said, "Thank you, sir," and he'd said, "Don't do that," and she'd said, "Do what?" and he'd said, "Thank me for a telephone," and gone back to his reading. And then on a Friday afternoon she came down the corridor toward the study with the mail in her hand, and heard Salvatore Gallo's voice through the door, low and even, saying something with a name in it she didn't catch, and then saying, "No, not while she's in the house." Charlotte stepped through the doorway. Salvatore was at the window with his phone against his ear and his back to her, and he turned and saw her, and hung up. He didn't say goodbye to whoever it was. He didn't finish the sentence. He simply took the phone away from his ear, and ended the call, and slid it into his coat pocket, and then he smiled at her, warmly, the way he always did. "Charlotte," he said, "you're a hard woman to keep up with." The storm came in off the water on a Wednesday, and by midnight, there were 14 inches on the ground and the plows had given up on the side roads. Charlotte was in the kitchen at 1 a.m. waiting for a kettle, because she'd found that she couldn't sleep in a house this quiet, and had started coming down to sit with a cup of tea in the one room that still smelled like a place where people lived. The back door came open hard enough to bang against the wall. Cold came through the kitchen in a wave and took the papers off the counter. And Charlotte turned with the kettle in her hand, and Vincent was in the doorway, alone, holding the frame with his right hand. No coat, no driver. He'd come up the drive on his own, and through the yard on his own, and there was no one behind him. He got 2 steps in, and the door swung shut, and he put his shoulder against the end of the island, and stopped there with his head down. "Mr. Marchetti." Charlotte set the kettle on the counter. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm calling Dr. Evans." "No, you need a doctor." "Evans takes money from people I don't take money from," Vincent said, through his teeth. His face had gone the color of dishwater, and there was sweat at his hairline in a kitchen that was still freezing from the open door. "Nobody comes in. Nobody goes out. Nobody gets called. Then a hospital. Especially not a hospital." He tried to push himself off the island and get to the stairs, and his legs didn't take it. He went down the front of the cabinets and ended up on the floor with his back against them and his left arm held tight across his body. Charlotte stood over him for 1 second with the whole thing rising up in her, the panic and the wrongness of it. A man like this on a kitchen floor. And then something else took over. Something she'd built without meaning to across 3 years of corridors and waiting rooms, watching nurses work on her sister at 2 in the morning while everyone else in the building slept. She wasn't a nurse, but she'd watched hands work more times than most people ever do. She knelt down beside him. "Take the jacket off." He looked up at her, and his eyes were having trouble finding her face. "What?" "Take the jacket off, Vincent." She heard herself use his name, and it felt like putting a foot through a pane of glass. And she kept going. "If you pass out before I can get to it, you're going to bleed on this floor, and I'm going to have to explain it to Mrs. Hale in the morning." He didn't argue. He set his jaw and let her help him get the sleeve down and off, and she folded it away out of sight without looking at it. "Kitchen shears are in the second drawer. Your first aid kit's upstairs." "Which bathroom?" "Mine. Third drawer, left side." She went up the service stairs 2 at a time, and came back down with the case in both arms. And by then his eyes had closed. "Hey!" She went to her knees beside him, and put her hand flat against his cheek, and it was cold. "Look at me. Eyes open. Stay with me a minute." His eyes opened. She got the kit open on the floor, and laid a clean towel out, and set everything on it in the order she'd need it, the way she'd seen it done, and she cut the sleeve away, and turned the lamp on the counter toward him and said, "This is going to be bad," and poured the iodine. What came out of him wasn't a shout. It was lower than that, and worse. And his whole body came up off the cabinets, and his right hand shot out and closed around her wrist. It was fast and it was blind, and there was nothing in it of him at all. His grip shut down like a clamp, and Charlotte felt her hand go numb to the fingertips. She didn't pull. She didn't cry out. She put her free hand over his and held it there and looked straight into his face and said, quietly, "It's me." He didn't hear it. "Vincent, it's me. Let go." Something came back into his eyes then, slow, like a man surfacing, and he saw where his hand was and what it was doing, and he let go so fast that his arm hit the cabinet behind him. He stared at her wrist. "I'm sorry." His voice had almost nothing in it. "I know." Charlotte turned her hand over once, flexed the fingers, and picked up the gauze. "Hold this. Press hard and don't let up." He put his hand where she told him to, and she got the case open the rest of the way, and threaded the curved needle, and while she worked he watched her face instead of what she was doing, and he understood after a while that her hands weren't shaking. Not at all. She was completely calm, on the floor of a kitchen at 1:30 in the morning, doing something no one had ever taught her, in a house full of men who were all asleep. "You've done this?" he said. "I've watched it done. On my sister, 100 times. You get used to it." She threaded the last stitch, and tied it off and sat back on her heels, and pushed her hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist. "That's the part I don't want, getting used to it." She started putting things away. "If you get used to blood, it means you've stopped caring whose it is." It had taken her 20 minutes. 20 minutes of her hands on his skin. Holding, turning, steadying, closing. The whole side of her palm braced against his forearm the entire time. And he'd lain there on a cold floor, and let a woman he'd owned for 3 weeks put her hands all over him. And there was no crawl and no cold, and no turning of the stomach. There was nothing. There was only the pressure of somebody's hands, and the light off the counter, and the storm going against the windows, and a kind of quiet in him he had no name for at all. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until 6 in the morning, on her knees with bleach and a wire brush, and a bucket of water hot enough to hurt. And when the day staff came in at 7, there was nothing to find but the smell of a room that had been cleaned harder than it needed to be. She went up at 9:30 with a tray. He was at the desk in a clean shirt, jacket on, sitting the way a man sits when he's decided that sitting a certain way will hold him together. She set the tray down. Then she went back and turned the lock on the study door from the inside. "Take the jacket off," she said. "I've got the captain's at 10. Then you've got 20 minutes for me to look at it." He let out a short breath through his nose and took the jacket off and unbuttoned the cuff and let her roll the sleeve back. Charlotte lifted the gauze carefully. The bruise had come up overnight, purple going down into black along the whole width of the arm, but the edges of the closure were clean and pale, and there was no heat coming off it. No red lines. No swelling worth worrying about. "You got lucky." She put ointment on with the pad of one finger, unhurried, and taped a fresh square over it. He looked down at the top of her head while she worked. She'd been up all night and he could see it in her shoulders. "You didn't sleep. Neither did you." I don't like blood, he said. I didn't want to close my eyes and see it on that floor again. She paused for perhaps a second, her hands resting on his forearm, and then went on and rolled the sleeve down. Wait. He opened the top drawer of the desk. There was a heavy metallic sound in the quiet room, and he took out something small and black and set it flat on the leather blotter between them and slid it across. Charlotte looked at it the way you'd look at a snake in a kitchen. Last night wasn't a warehouse man with a grudge, Vincent said, keeping his voice down so that she had to lean in to hear it. Somebody sold the route I was on. That's a short list. That list is my own security. He tapped the desk once. So I don't trust anybody in this house right now. Then you don't trust me either. You're the only person in the world who knows I'm bleeding, he said. That makes you a liability to my enemies, and it makes you the one thing I've got. Take it. She didn't move to pick it up. There's no separate safety. It's in the trigger. You point it, and you pull. The recoil will throw your wrists back if you don't lock your elbows, and at the distance you'd ever use it, that won't matter. She still didn't move. Mr. Marchetti. She looked up. I have a felony conviction. He said nothing. 3 years ago. In this state, a person with a felony conviction who's found in possession of a firearm goes away for a mandatory minimum, not probation, not a fine. They don't care why I had it. They don't care whose house it was in. They don't care that I've never so much as had a parking ticket since. That's what I'd be picking up off this desk. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then don't let anybody see it, he said. Charlotte let out something that wasn't quite a laugh. Then she reached across the blotter and picked the gun up, and it was heavier than it looked, dense and cold, and she put it in the deep front pocket of her apron where it hung there like an anchor. Why me? She said. I've told you why. No, why is there nobody else? You've got 40 men. You've got Mrs. Hale and you've got Salvatore and you've had all of them for 20 years, and you're handing this to a woman you've known for 6 weeks. He turned his chair slightly toward the window and was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. 7 years ago there was a woman in this house, he said. Elena Ferraro. He said the name the way you'd read it off a list. She was here 5 months. She was very good at it. She learned when the gate rotated, and which car my father used, and which nights he stayed over, instead of driving back into the city. A pause. She'd been sent. Sheridan's people didn't send her. Somebody else did, and I never found out who. And that's not a thing I say out loud very often. Charlotte stood very still. She was in my bed, Vincent said. That was the whole of her job. And on the 17th of January, my father came out of this house at 6:10 in the morning, because she'd told them when he'd be doing it, and I was upstairs asleep, and the first I knew about any of it was the noise. He stopped there. He didn't go any further, and Charlotte didn't ask him to. After that, he said, it turned out I couldn't be touched. Not by a woman. Not by anyone. It isn't a preference. It's not something I decided. Somebody puts a hand on my sleeve and my body behaves as though I'm being poisoned. I've had 3 doctors explain it to me in 3 different sets of words, and none of it made any difference. That's the rule Mrs. Hale gives out on the first morning. That's all it ever was. Charlotte didn't tell him she was sorry. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, or that it had been a long time, or any of the other things people say to fill a silence they can't stand. She'd had enough said to her over the years to know exactly what all of it was worth. She stood there with a gun in her apron and looked at him, and then she said, Your coffee's getting cold. Vincent looked up. It is, he said, and she picked up the tray and went and unlocked the door. And neither of them said one word about the 20 minutes on the kitchen floor, or about her hands, or about the fact that nothing at all had happened to him while she'd had them on his skin. 2 days later, Salvatore Gallo came into the study without knocking and put a folder down on the desk in front of Vincent and stepped back with his hands folded. You told me to look at everyone, he said. I looked at everyone. Vincent opened it. There was a booking photograph on the first page, and it took him a second to be sure, because in it she was younger and heavier in the face, and her hair was down. Charlotte Ann Bishop. Below it a docket number, a plea date, a sentence. 14 months at the State Correctional Institution in Framingham. Larceny over $1,200, by single scheme. 14 months, Salvatore said. Served 11, out on good time. She's been off paper about a year and a half. Vincent turned the page. You knew? I knew there was a felony. The agency told me on the first call. They tell you that up front now. He looked up. You went and pulled the file. I pulled everybody's file. Mrs. Hale's, The chefs, the 2 men on the gate, the girl who does the west corridor. Salvatore's voice was reasonable and even, the voice of a man carrying something heavy for somebody else. You told me the leaks inside this house. You told me you don't trust anyone. So I stopped trusting anyone, including the woman who's been in your private rooms every day for 6 weeks, and who came here 3 days before all this started. He shrugged very slightly. That's the job, Vincent. If you wanted a man who'd leave a stone unturned, you'd have promoted somebody else. Vincent looked at the photograph for a while longer. Then he closed the folder. Get Charlotte. She came in with the folder still on the desk where she could see the corner of it, and she saw the color of the paper and stopped in the middle of the room, and Vincent watched something go out of her face. He didn't ask her to sit. Framingham, he said. Yes. 14 months. 11. Served. She had her hands at her sides. You want to hear it, or do you want me to get my things? Tell me. I was a bookkeeper, Charlotte said. A contracting outfit in Quincy. 6 trucks. Maybe 20 guys. I did the payroll and the invoices, and I did them well. And the man who owned it took $140,000 out of the operating account over 2 years and moved it through vendor accounts he'd set up himself. When it came apart, he told the investigators that his bookkeeper had done it. Everything had my login on it. He'd been signing in as me for a year and a half because I'd given him my password myself, in an email, when he asked for it, because he was my boss and I was 23 years old. And it never once occurred to me to say no. Vincent said nothing. The public defender had 111 open cases. I met her twice, both times in a hallway. Charlotte's voice didn't rise at all. She told me the state was offering 14 months, and that if I turned it down and lost at trial, I was looking at 5 years. And she said, and I remember this, she said, honey, a jury looks at a girl who lives in a basement apartment, and it looks at a man with a business and a wife and a house in Milton, and then it decides which one of you stole. She wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate. You pled. I pled. To something you didn't do. I did not take $1, Charlotte said. Not one, but I was poor. And nobody believes a poor person. Mr. Marchetti. That's the whole of it. That's the entire mechanism. If I'd had $40,000 for a lawyer, I'd have walked out of that courthouse and gone back to work on Monday. She stopped. Then she said, more quietly, and it's not the 14 months. That's what people never understand. It's after. Every application asks. Every landlord asks. I have not been able to get a job that pays over $16 an hour in 3 years. And when my sister got hurt, there was no cushion and no credit and no bank on this earth that would sit down with me. And that's why I was in your study at 1 a.m. asking a man like you for money. Salvatore, by the window, said nothing at all. Vincent sat back. He'd spent his whole life listening to men explain themselves, and there was a rhythm to a rehearsed story, a smoothness, a place where the speaker slows down to make sure you get the part they most want you to have. Hers had none of it. She'd told it flat and out of order, and she'd stopped in the wrong places. And when she got to the part that mattered most, she'd gone quieter instead of louder. He'd have known. He'd have known in the first 30 seconds. Salvatore, he said. Yeah. Anything else in the file? That's the whole of it. 2 speeding tickets and a shut-off notice. Then we're done with it. Salvatore looked at him a moment, and then nodded and went out and pulled the door to behind him. Charlotte stood there with her hands still at her sides. That's it? That's it. You believe me? Yes. She looked at him as though she were waiting for the rest of it to arrive. People don't, she said. I know what people do, Vincent said. He put his hand flat on the folder and pushed it into the drawer and shut it. I've had one person in 7 years I could believe, and it wasn't a person. It was a woman who lied to me in this house every day for 5 months, and I never caught a single one of them. He looked up. You've told me the ugliest thing about yourself before I had to find it. Elena told me nothing, and I found out at 6:10 in the morning. Charlotte didn't say anything. Go on, he said. There's a car coming at 4. And she went out. And Vincent sat there a while with his hand on the closed drawer and thought about how strange it was to have just done a thing he hadn't done since he was 30 years old, which was to decide that somebody was telling him the truth. It came up on a Sunday evening over nothing at all. She'd taken her weekly call in his study because he'd told her to, and he'd stayed at the desk with a file open in front of him and hadn't gone out. And when she hung up, she stood with her hand on the phone for a second the way she always did. Well, he said, without looking up. She held a cup. Charlotte said, by herself, for about half a minute. That's good. It's very good. She was still standing there. The therapist said it's muscle memory. She waited tables for 9 years, so her hands know things her head doesn't. She said sometimes with brain injuries, the oldest habits come back first. Vincent turned a page. Where'd she wait tables? A restaurant in the North End, little place on Hanover Street, 26 seats. Charlotte smiled slightly, to herself. She was there so long the owner used to say she came with the building. Vincent stopped turning the page. He didn't move. He didn't look up, and afterward Charlotte would remember that he didn't look up, and would think about how much a man can hold still. Which one on Hanover? He said. It's not there anymore. There was a fire, back in June. That's how she got hurt. She said it the way she'd said it 100 times. The flat, worn way you say the sentence that ended your life once you've had to say it to enough clerks. Smoke. She was in the back, doing the closing count. They got her out, but not fast enough. She picked up the tray. Anyway, half a minute. I'll be up at 6. Good night, Vincent said. The door closed. He sat where he was for perhaps 2 minutes without moving at all. Then he got up and went to the cabinet behind the desk and took out the ledgers. There were 4 of them, one for each year. And the 3rd year was the one he wanted, and he put it on the desk and opened it and went through it page by page with his finger. The North End list ran 11 pages, 400 and some businesses, laid out by street, and each entry had a name and an address and a number and a small mark in the far column that meant the arrangement was current. He found Hanover Street. He ran down it, and there it was, 3rd from the bottom, a restaurant with 26 seats, and the mark in the far column was not the mark for current, it was the other one. Vincent sat down slowly. Under the system his father built, and he'd inherited, that second mark meant a business had stopped paying, and had said so out loud. There were exactly 2 things that were supposed to happen after that. The first was a conversation. The second, if the conversation went nowhere, was that the family walked away and left them to whatever came, which, in the North End, was generally nothing at all, because the whole thing had been theater for 30 years. There was no third thing. Vincent had made that clear in front of every capo in this house when he was 30 years old, 6 weeks after his father was killed. Nobody touches a building. Not a window, not a door frame, not a fire. He'd said it in that dining room with his hands flat on the table. He remembered saying it. He went and got the other book, the one that tracked what came in and from where, and he sat with both of them open under the lamp and worked backwards. It took him a long time. He wasn't an accountant, and he'd never wanted to be, but he knew his own operation the way a man knows the sound of his own car, and what he was looking for was the place where the sound was wrong. He found the first one in the spring of the year before, a tailor's shop on Salem Street. Stopped paying in March, marked delinquent in April. And there was a fire in the stockroom in May. Electrical, no injuries, and the shop never reopened. And then, in September, a line of income into the family's construction subsidiary from a firm he didn't recognize, in an amount that would have made no sense to anyone who didn't know what a commercial insurance settlement on a Salem Street storefront looks like. He found the second one in August. He found the third in November, a print shop on Prince Street. He found 5 more after that. Every single one of them had stopped paying first. Every single one had a fire within 90 days. Every single one had money coming back into the house 4 to 6 months later through a firm with a name like a law office, and the firm was different every time, and every one of those firms had been set up out of the same registered agent's office in Providence. Vincent sat back. It was 2:10 in the morning. There was one man in this organization who could set up a company in Rhode Island without him hearing about it. There was one man who could put a line item into the construction subsidiary and have it signed off. One man who'd sat at that dining table when Vincent had said the words "nobody touches a building." One man who'd nodded and said "you're the boss," always have been, and who for 30 years had stood half a step behind and slightly to the left, being furniture until somebody needed him. Vincent got up and stood at the window for a long time. He thought about a woman on her knees on the kitchen floor at 1:30 in the morning with his blood on her hands, telling him that if you get used to it, you've stopped caring whose it is. He thought about 11 seconds with a spoon, and half a minute with a cup. He thought about a name, said twice into a pillow by somebody with a fever, and about the fact that the money that had paid for her sister's care had come out of the same house, the same books, the same hands. He'd sent men to do it. Not knowing was not the same as not having done it, and he'd stopped believing otherwise a long time ago. His own people had put Julia Bishop in that chair. He spent 4 days making sure. He pulled the Providence filings himself, through a lawyer who'd never met Salvatore Gallo, and by Thursday morning, there was a folder on his desk with 8 fires in it, and 8 settlements and 1 registered agent, and there was no way left to read it that let anybody off. Toby Nash came in at 9 and stood on the other side of the desk while Vincent told him, and listened all the way through without once interrupting, which was why Vincent had chosen him. When it was done, Toby was quiet for a while. "You're going to tell her," he said. "Yes. Then let me say the other thing first, and then I'll shut up about it." Toby put his hands on the back of the chair. "You don't have to. You could move the sister to the best place in New England tomorrow morning and pay for it out of a trust with a name on it that isn't yours, and she'd never know where $1 of it came from. She'd have her sister taken care of for life. She'd have a job. She'd keep whatever it is she's got in this house right now, which is more than you've had in 7 years, and I'm not blind." He shrugged. "Nobody would ever find out. There's nobody left alive who'd tell her. I'd know, boss. I'd know every morning," Vincent said, "and she'd be sitting across from me not knowing. And that's the same thing Elena did to me. The exact same thing. She just did it for the other side." Toby looked at the floor, and then nodded once, slowly. "Then say it plain," he said. "Don't dress it. Women can smell a man dressing something. He sent for her at 10. She came in with a tray out of habit, and he told her to leave it by the door. Then he pushed the folder across the desk and said, 'Sit down and read that.'" Charlotte sat down. She read for a long time. He watched her go through the first 2 pages fast, the way you read something you don't understand yet, and then slow down on the 3rd, and then stop moving altogether somewhere on the 4th, which was the page with Hanover Street on it. She went back a page. She went forward again. Then she closed the folder and put both hands flat on top of it and sat there, and the room was so quiet that he could hear the clock out in the corridor. She didn't shout. He'd braced for shouting. She looked up at him and her face was perfectly composed, and she said, "What's his name?" "Salvatore Gallo." She took that in. She'd handed that man his coat. She'd made his coffee, twice a week, with 2 sugars, and he'd always thanked her by name. "How long have you known?" she said. 4 days. Charlotte nodded. She looked down at her own hands on the folder for a moment, and then she stood up, and she reached behind her and untied her apron. She pulled it over her head, then she folded it, without hurrying, in half and in half again, squaring the corners the way she squared everything, and she set it down on the edge of the desk. There was a weight in the pocket. Neither of them said anything about it. She left it there. "I don't think you did it," she said. "I want you to know that I don't think that. It doesn't matter." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." And she picked up her coat off the chair by the door and walked out of the study, down the corridor, through the front hall, past 2 men who didn't know what to do and looked to him and got nothing, and out the front door into the snow. It had started up again around 9 and was coming down steadily now, and she went down the long drive on foot with her coat open because she'd forgotten to button it. Vincent stood at the window and watched her go the whole way, all the way to the gate, until the white took her. He didn't send a car. He didn't send Toby after her. He'd taken everything else from her already, one way or another, and he wasn't going to take the walking out too. She got a ride most of the way with a plow driver and the bus the rest, and the apartment was 55 degrees when she opened the door because she'd let the heat down further when she moved out. She stood in the middle of it with her coat still on. Then she turned the lamp on and went to the closet and knelt down and pulled out the box. It had come from the restaurant. The owner's daughter had dropped it off in September in a paper grocery bag. Everything they'd found in the staff locker, and Charlotte had put it in the closet without opening it, and had gone on not opening it for 8 months, because there'd always been a shift to get to, or a bill to fight, or a reason, and because the truth was simpler than any of that. She'd been afraid of it. She sat on the floor with the box in her lap and pulled the tape off. An apron, folded, a paperback with the cover creased back, a hair tie, a tube of hand cream, a name tag with Julia, stamped into the plastic in white letters, and at the bottom, under all of it, in a side pocket, her sister's old phone. Charlotte sat there holding it. Then she got up and found her charger and plugged it into the wall by the couch, and sat down on the floor beside the outlet with her knees drawn up, and waited. It took a long time, and then the screen came on. The photographs were in a folder Julia had made and named with the date. 3 men on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, shot through the front window from behind the register, slightly crooked, the way you take a picture when you're holding the phone at your hip. The same 3 men a week later. Then 2 of them at the door with the owner. And in that one, the man on the left had turned his head toward the camera, and Charlotte knew the shape of that head. She'd hung his coat on a hook in a front hall in Weston. The voice memo was underneath them. It ran 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and it had been recorded 3 days before the fire. And Julia had clearly set the phone down on a shelf near the pass, because the sound came in at a distance, with dishes going somewhere behind it. The owner's voice, tired, saying he'd paid for 19 years and he wasn't paying any more. And then a second voice, easy and warm, a voice that had told Charlotte she was a hard woman to keep up with. Nobody's asking you to like it, Frank. I'm asking you to be practical. This street burns twice a decade, whether anybody helps it or not. A pause. You want me to say it plainer? Salvatore Gallo is telling you, in your own kitchen, with your own coffee in front of him, that a building with no arrangement is a building nobody's watching. Charlotte played it 3 times. Then she went back to the messages, because there was a red badge sitting on the icon, and she'd known it was there for 10 minutes and had been leaving it for last. It was a draft. Unsent, saved at 4:20 in the afternoon of a day in June, addressed to her, "Come home for dinner tonight." Charlotte sat on the floor of a 55-degree apartment with her back against the wall and held her sister's phone in both hands. The Bureau's Boston office is on Chardon Street, and she was outside it at 8:10 the next morning, and she asked for Diane Keller by name, and gave her own, and waited 40 minutes in a lobby chair. Keller came down and took her upstairs to a small room with a table in it. Charlotte put the phone down on the table and played her the memo, all 4 minutes of it, and watched the woman's face while it ran. She'd expected a great many things. She hadn't expected that. The color went out of Diane Keller's face at about the 90-second mark, and it did not come back. She sat very still until the recording ended, and then she reached over and stopped it herself, and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "How long have you had this?" she said. "Since last night. Who else has heard it?" "Nobody." Keller got up. She went to the door and looked out through the glass into the corridor, and she stood there a moment with her hand on the frame, and then she came back and said, "Miss Bishop, I need you to leave the building. That's evidence of 8 arsons and a woman in a wheelchair." "I know what it is." "Then take it." "I'm going to handle this, internally," Keller said, "and I need you out of this office in the next 5 minutes, and I need you not to come back here and not to call this number." And that was when Charlotte understood, sitting in a plastic chair with her coat in her lap. She thought about a bus shelter on Broadway in the rain, and a woman saying, "We already have somebody inside that house." She thought about 8 fires that had every one of them been reported, investigated, and closed. She thought about a man who could set up companies in Providence for 6 years and never once be looked at by anybody. "He's yours," Charlotte said. Keller didn't answer. "For how long?" "I've been in this unit 2 years," Keller said, and she said it carefully, and the care in it was the answer. "There are decisions in this file that were made before I got here, and they were made by people above me, and I have been told twice that the assets product is too valuable to jeopardize." He never told his handler about the fires. He couldn't have, and he didn't, and I don't believe for 1 second that anybody upstairs knew about that restaurant. She picked up the phone and put it back into Charlotte's hand and closed her fingers over it. "But he spent 6 years knowing that nobody in this city can look at him. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He's been safe from us, and safe from them at the same time, and he's had 6 years to get comfortable, and you just walked into a federal building with the thing that ends it. Then arrest him. Not from here. Not this morning." Keller's voice dropped. "Go. Take that with you. Don't go home, and don't go anywhere he'd think to look, and I'll call you tonight from a phone that isn't mine." She was already at the door. "Miss Bishop, whatever you do, don't take it to Marchetti." Charlotte was on the 2 o'clock bus west out of Boston, with the phone zipped into the inside pocket of her coat. She got off at the stop nearest the Weston line and walked the last 1.5 miles in the dark along a road with no sidewalk. And she came up on the gate at 10 to 7 in the evening and stopped. The house was black, not one light, not the fixtures on the columns, not the lamps down the drive, not the security floods over the garages that ran all night every night. Nothing. She stood at the gate in the cold, and the generators didn't come on, and after 20 seconds she understood that they weren't going to. The pedestrian gate was standing open. That gate was never open. Charlotte went through it and went up the drive at a run, keeping to the grass at the edge. And she was halfway to the house when she heard the first sound come out of it, flat and small and wrong, and then two more after it. She came in through the kitchen door, and Vincent came around the corner of the passage with a light in one hand and stopped when he saw her, and for a second neither of them said anything at all. "The night captain," he said. They came in through his gate. They caught Toby and the guard shift off guard. He caught her sleeve and pulled her toward the service stairs. "The bedroom. The walls are steel and the doors mechanical. Go." Before she could move, he reached into the drawer by the passage, pulled out the heavy black weapon she had left on his desk days ago, and pressed it firmly into her hands. "Take it," he whispered. "You know how to hold it." They went up in the dark with her hand on the back of his coat, along the corridor, into the room, and he threw the bolts, all three of them, and put his back against the door and listened. Then the first weight came against it from the other side, and the frame moved. The door held twice and gave on the third, not all at once, but at the hinge side, and then the room was full of light from a lamp somebody was carrying, and Salvatore Gallo came through it with two men behind him. He didn't look at the broken frame. He looked at Charlotte first, and he smiled the way he'd always smiled at her. And then he said, to Vincent, "You should know one thing before we finish. I put her in this house." Vincent didn't answer. "The agency's mine. 2 shells and a management company. I've owned it since before your father died. I read every file that comes through it. He was enjoying it, and he was letting himself. 3 weeks ago I found a woman with a felony conviction, and a sister dying in a state program, and $85,000 she couldn't raise, and I sent her up your service stairs, because a man in your position is going to need somebody to hand the blame to eventually, and I like to have her picked out early." He tilted his head. "You've done everything I hoped. You let her clean your rooms. You gave her a weapon out of your own drawer. 7 years, Vincent, and you learned nothing at all from Elena." Vincent looked at Charlotte. It lasted 1 second. He'd had 7 years of a body that wouldn't let anyone near it. And all these weeks of a woman who moved through his rooms like weather and left nothing behind, and a night on a kitchen floor with her hands on him and no sickness anywhere in him at all. "I know who she is," he said. "You don't." Salvatore's face changed, and he brought the gun up. The shot came from Charlotte's side of the room. She had her elbows locked exactly the way he'd told her to lock them, and the recoil threw her wrists back, and she stayed on her feet, and Salvatore went sideways into the door frame and down onto one knee, with his hand clamped to his shoulder, and the gun on the carpet, a yard away from him. Nobody moved. In the silence, Charlotte took her sister's phone out of her coat, and held it up, and pressed play. The voice that came out of it was warm and easy and unmistakable, and it filled that dark, ruined room, and went out through the broken door and down the corridor. "This street burns twice a decade whether anybody helps it or not. A building with no arrangement is a building nobody's watching." And then, further in, the thing Charlotte had found on the 4th listening at 3 o'clock in the morning, Salvatore's voice saying to the restaurant owner that he had friends who could make a great deal of trouble go away for a man, federal friends, that he'd been talking to them for years, and that Frank should think hard about who in this city was actually protected. It ran on. The 2 men behind him had stopped in the doorway. Out in the corridor there were 4 more, and every one of them had walked into that house that night for Salvatore Gallo, and every one of them was listening to him say, in his own voice, that he'd burned businesses under the Marchetti name and sold the family to the government. One by one, without a word passing between them, they lowered their weapons. Vincent picked the gun up off the carpet and stood over him. He could have. Every man in that hallway expected it, and not one of them would have said a word about it for the rest of his life. "I don't kill people over money," Vincent said. "I don't kill them over this either. You're going to live, and you're going to sit in a room and hear people call what you did by its right name, out loud, with your daughters in the gallery." Diane Keller came through the gate at 9:20, with a great many people behind her, and Salvatore Gallo was taken out of that house in handcuffs on a stretcher, and the arson counts were federal, and the injury made them worse, and there was nobody left upstairs willing to stand in front of it. Keller wrote Charlotte's shot up as defense of another, which is what it was under Massachusetts law, and no charge was ever brought against her. It came out within the week that the $4.2 million had never gone to Declan Sheridan at all. Salvatore had been bleeding it out of the terminals for 2 years to pay for the fires. And Vincent sat down across from the old man in a diner in Southie and said so plainly, and Sheridan looked at him a long moment and said that his father would never have done that, and Vincent said he knew. Then he gave the rest of it to the government. All of it. The ledgers, the routes, the 400 businesses. And it took 11 months, and it cost him almost everything his family had built in 60 years. And when it was done, what remained was a marina, a construction firm, and paper that could be read out loud in any courtroom in the country. He didn't complain about it once. He burned the page out of the debt ledger over a crystal ashtray with a silver lighter and set up a trust that would carry Julia Bishop for the rest of her life, whatever happened to him. And then he told Charlotte to go. He said it as an order, standing at the desk, not looking at her. He said she had blood in her hair and powder on her hands, and that everything he touched went into the ground eventually, and that she should take the trust and get out of this house before he changed his mind. Charlotte crossed the room and stopped a foot in front of him. "Don't you ever decide for me what I can carry?" she said. "I was already broken when I met you. I was counting quarters in a glove compartment to see if I could get to the hospital and back. That was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it had nothing to do with you." She reached up and put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, and his heart was going hard and uneven under the cotton, and he didn't flinch, and he didn't step back, and he didn't move away from her at all. He stood there and let it happen. Then he turned and unlocked the glass cabinet and took out the chipped white teacup and held it a moment and said that it had been his mother's, and that it was the only thing left from the apartment over the bakery on Prince Street, where he'd been a boy before any of the rest of it. He filled a glass at the tap and put it in her hand. A year later, there was a marina south of the city with clean books and 40 slips, and on a Saturday in June, Julia Bishop sat in her chair at the end of the dock in the sun and said her sister's name, twice, clearly, and then laughed out loud at a seagull that came down after somebody's sandwich, and Charlotte had to turn around and face the water for a minute. The house in Weston was sold. The one they lived in was small, and there were photographs on the walls of it. Here is what that story is really about. The people who clean our rooms and push our chairs and carry our trays are not invisible, and the cost of failing to see a human being is always higher than anyone expects. A glass of water handed to a stranger at the right moment can save a life. And kindness has never once needed to be grand to be enough. The truth has to be spoken even when speaking it takes everything, because a person kept comfortable by a lie has not been protected, only used. And no one is ever permanently defined by the worst thing that ever happened to them, or by the worst thing anyone ever accused them of. Now I would love to hear from you. What did this story stir up in your own heart? And have you ever known someone the world looked straight past? Someone whose worth you saw when nobody else bothered to? Please leave a comment and tell me about them, because I read every one of them, and there is a great deal we can all learn from each other. If this story moved you, do subscribe to our channel and press that like button and pass it along to someone who could use it today, so that more of these stories can find their way to you every day. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end. I wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next video.